Darius appointed 120 high-ranking officials to govern each province. He also appointed 3 prime ministers, including Daniel, to report to the officials. In other words, Darius divided the entire country into 120 administrative districts and governed them. However, the ancient historian Herodotus recorded that Persia divided the entire country into 20 provinces and governed them. And according to Esther 1:1 and Esther chapter 89, it is recorded that during the reign of King Ahasuerus, the entire country was divided into 127 administrative districts. And 250 years later, Josephus, who was active at that time, recorded that Persia divided the entire country into 360 administrative districts. In other words, it can be seen that the administrative districts of the Persian Empire gradually expanded. Daniel, who had been in retirement since the death of Nebuchadnezzar in 562 BC, returned to the scene of history as prime minister 23 years later, through the events of Belshazzar in 539 BC. At this time, he was over 80 years old. However, Darius appointed Daniel, who was over 80 years old, as prime minister. This was because he believed that Daniel, with his wisdom and ability, would be able to perform his duties well regardless of his age. The duties and powers of the prime minister were very great. Daniel 6:2 with 3 administrators over them, one of whom was Daniel. The satraps were made accountable to them, so that the king might not suffer loss. Here, give accounts to is literally translated as do the calculations. This indicates that the main task of the officials was related to collecting taxes. The prime minister's main job was to direct and supervise the officials' tax collection, so that the king would not suffer financially. 3 prime ministers were appointed for this job, but Daniel, who was over 80 years old, was given the most important job. Daniel 6:3 says, "Now Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators and the satraps by his exceptional qualities, that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom." Quick-witted means outstanding, extraordinary, and extreme. Daniel was extremely outstanding compared to the 3 prime ministers and the 120 officials. It is only natural for a king to want to appoint such an outstanding person to a high position. Joseph, who was sold to Egypt in the past, became the second in command in Egypt for the same reason. Darius also saw the outstanding ability of Daniel and appointed him as the second in command, the top of the prime ministers after the king. That is why he had the other 2 prime ministers get their approvals from Daniel. Perhaps the 2 prime ministers were not as transparent and clean as Daniel was in the areas they were in charge of. However, it was Darius's thoughts that led to the conspiracy against Daniel. There was someone who was jealous of a successful person and tried to trip him or push him over. Daniel was a foreigner who had been taken as a prisoner. However, he was now more prominent than the natives. The natives then looked for an excuse to bring Daniel down, but they could not find any excuse for Daniel. No matter how hard they tried, they couldn't find any fault with him. The officials and prime ministers tried to find a reason to accuse Daniel of wrongdoing in state affairs, but they couldn't find any. This is because Daniel was loyal to Darius and had no wrongdoing or faults. He made no mistakes in state affairs and was not corrupt. Therefore, Darius had every reason to favor Daniel. However, even for such a loyal man, there was a conspiracy of envy and jealousy. The prime minister and the officials, who could not find any wrongdoing in the affairs of state, tried to find fault with Daniel's faith. Daniel 6:5 Finally these men said, "We will never find any basis for charges against this man, Daniel, unless it has something to do with the law of his God." So, they were going to use Daniel's strict observance of the Jewish law to accuse him. Even in the eyes of his enemies, Daniel was seen as a man who would respect God's will in any situation and do as he commands. Therefore, they would make the state's demands and God's demands conflict with each other. And Daniel would naturally choose God's demands, making him a sinner who would reject the state's demands. To make this plan a success, a new law had to be enacted. So they went to King Darius and presented the decree they had drafted. Daniel 6:7 The royal administrators, prefects, satraps, advisors and governors have all agreed that the king should issue an edict and enforce the decree that anyone who prays to any god or human being during the next 30 days, except to you, your majesty, shall be thrown into the lion's den. They were very cunning. They pretended to be a bill that would enhance the king's dignity, and they got the king's approval for it, intending to use the law to get rid of Daniel, who was the king's most trusted man. Daniel was a man who prayed to God no matter what, so they thought he would pray to God even if this law was enacted. Who signed this bill? All the prime ministers, governors, judges, and officials. All the high-ranking officials signed this law. This means that this was not a conspiracy started by a certain person who hated Daniel. It was an incident caused by jealousy and envy from the entire Persian aristocracy. In other words, the Persian aristocracy could not tolerate Daniel, who became the prime minister and then the chief minister on the subject of captivity. In the end, Daniel became an object of hatred of the upper class of Persia. The enemies who drafted the bill demanded that King Darius stamp it. They reminded him of the Persian tradition that no one could change the law once it was stamped by the king. This bill was a scheme to have the king kill his favorite servant without any recourse. Now, Daniel's enemies had deceived King Darius in order to get rid of Daniel. However, Darius did not notice their plot and stamped the bill to make it a law. So, the law was announced that anyone who asks for anything from any god or man other than the king for 30 days shall be thrown into the lion's den. First, Daniel continued to pray to God, even after the law banning prayer was announced, and was thrown into the lion's den as a result. Daniel 6:10. Now when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened toward Jerusalem. 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God. Just as he had done before. Daniel said that he opened the window facing Jerusalem in his room and knelt down to pray 3 times a day to God. Daniel knew that the law promulgated by his enemies was a sword pointed at him. Daniel, who was wise, could not have failed to notice that the enemies, knowing that he prayed to Jerusalem every day, had encouraged the king to promulgate the law to get rid of him. Nevertheless, Daniel went up to the upper room, opened the window facing Jerusalem, and prayed 3 times a day, falling into the trap of his enemies. Why did he not stop praying even though he knew about the plot of his enemies? Daniel knew that the law promulgated by his enemies was a sword pointed at him. What is clear is that Daniel did not pray to show off his religiosity. Instead, he prayed 3 times a day, opening the window facing Jerusalem and falling into the plot of his enemies. Why did he not stop praying even though he knew about the plot of his enemies? Daniel did not give in to the difficult test, and did not give up his faith and prayers. In other words, for Daniel, prayer was a treasure more valuable than life. This is Daniel's faith. In particular, Daniel says that he offered a prayer of thanksgiving. What could he be thankful for? When the swords of his enemies were at his throat, he was thankful for the continued grace of God that had been bestowed upon him. For Daniel, gratitude for grace was more precious than life. That is why Daniel did not stop praying, even though the law required him to pray 3 times a day if he was sentenced to death. Many faithful people would have thought it wise not to pray during this 30-day period. However, Daniel continued to pray at the risk of his life. The enemies then accused Daniel. In verse 11, it says, "Then these men went as a group and found Daniel praying and asking God for help. During the 30 days, the eyes watching over Daniel increased due to the ban on anyone asking anything of any god or man other than the king. And the enemies, who had confirmed that Daniel was still praying, immediately ran to the king and accused him. Their accusation was carefully planned, so they went to the king and spoke to him about his royal decree. Did you not publish a decree that during the next 30 days, anyone who prays to any god or human being except to you, your majesty, would be thrown into the lion's den? And they reaffirm that the law the king has promulgated is a Persian tradition that even the king cannot change. Then, the king, who had not yet noticed their plot, responded to their plot. In the second half of verse 12, the king answered, "The decree stands in accordance with the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be repealed." With these words, King Darius cut off any way of saving Daniel. Then, the enemies finally accused Daniel in the open. In verse 13, then they said to the king, "Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, your majesty, or to the decree you put in writing. He still prays 3 times a day." 14 When the king heard this, he was greatly distressed. He was determined to rescue Daniel and made every effort until sundown to save him. Here, the accusers of Daniel say, "Daniel, one of the captives of Judah." Daniel was clearly holding the office of prime minister at the time, but they are calling him Daniel the captive. That is how much they are expressing jealousy and envy toward Daniel. In other words, they are showing their anger at the fact that a person of low status has become the prime minister, a position higher than theirs. And they emphasize that Daniel disobeyed the king and the king's decree. Despite the fact that the captive became the prime minister presumptuously, he dared to ignore the king and the king's law. They are emphasizing that he is a bad person who repays grace with enmity. They say, Daniel is a prisoner, but he became the prime minister. Now, King Darius has come to realize that the matter of the enactment of the decrees they have been discussing is not to elevate King Darius but to eliminate Daniel. Therefore, in verse 14, he said, when the king heard this, he was greatly distressed. He was determined to rescue Daniel and made every effort until sundown to save him. What is he saying? It can be seen that King Darius persuaded those who had accused Daniel to drop the charges. However, those who had accused Daniel demanded a severe judgment. At this time, Daniel does not make any excuses for himself. Rather, King Darius is defending Daniel in order to save him. However, the accusers of Daniel come in droves and say in verse 15, then the men went as a group to King Darius and said to him, remember, your majesty, that according to the law of the Medes and Persians no decree or edict that the king issues can be changed. Second, God is a God who protects those who pray from their enemies. King Darius's campaign to save Daniel fails, and Daniel is thrown into the lion's den. King Darius had no choice but to say that he hoped that the Almighty God whom Daniel served would save him when he sent Daniel to the lion's den. In verse 16, so the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. The king said to Daniel, "May your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you." And Daniel was thrown into the lion's den. The enemies threw Daniel into the lion's den and sealed the entrance with the king's seal and the seals of the nobles so that no one could take any action against Daniel. King Darius stopped eating and drinking and did not sleep. In verse 18, it says, "Then the king returned to his palace and spent the night without eating and without any entertainment being brought to him. And he could not sleep. And as soon as it was light, King Darius rushed to the lion's den and cried out to the den in a sad voice." 20 When he came near the den, he called to Daniel in an anguished voice, "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions?" 21-22 Then Daniel answered from the lion's den, Daniel answered, "May the king live forever." 22 My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me, because I was found innocent in his sight. Nor have I ever done any wrong before you, your majesty. The enemies put Daniel in the lion's den and sealed it, but God saved Daniel by sealing the lions' mouths. Then Daniel gave the reason why God saved him. In verse 22, he said, "Because I was found innocent in his sight. Nor have I ever done any wrong before you, your majesty." In other words, he claimed that God sent angels to save him because he had not sinned against God and had not harmed the king. Daniel considered his being thrown into the lion's den as a heavenly trial. In the ancient Near East, there was a divine heavenly trial. The logic of this trial was simple: if this person is guilty, the gods will kill him; if he is innocent, the gods will let him live. The most common method was to put the person on a boat and take him to the middle of a deep river and drown him. If they survive, they are innocent, and if they die, they are guilty. There is a similar case in the Bible. This is the regulations on the woman who commits adultery in Numbers 5. If a husband suspects his wife of adultery, but has no evidence and no witnesses, the family will be in distress. The husband who suspects his wife will beat her, and she may die during the beating. Therefore, if a husband suspects his wife, the husband and wife can go to the priest and ask for judgment. The priest can make the suspected wife drink the water of the curse and wait for the judgment of heaven. However, if the woman is guilty, her thighs will dry up and her belly swell. Then the people will stone her to death. But if she is innocent, nothing will happen. Then she will be found innocent by God. Daniel drank the cup of that curse. But he lived. This was God's declaration that he had not sinned against God, nor had he sinned against the king. Daniel is talking about this very point. If the woman is guilty, her thighs will become dry and her belly will swell. Then the people will stone her to death. But if she is innocent, nothing will happen to her. She will be declared innocent by God. Daniel drank the very cup of that curse. But he lived. This was God's declaration that he had not sinned against God or against the king. King Darius immediately had Daniel brought out of the lion's den. When he looked at him, there was not the slightest sign of injury. Then, the king had those who had accused Daniel arrested and threw them into the lion's den. He wanted them to pass through the divine judgment of heaven. If they were innocent, they would survive. But if they were guilty, they would die. In verse 24, it says, "At the king's command." The men who had falsely accused Daniel were brought in and thrown into the lion's den, along with their wives and children. And before they reached the floor of the den, the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. Those who accused Daniel were guilty. They were guilty of trying to kill someone out of envy and jealousy, of deceiving the king they were supposed to serve, and of wasting the king's property. They became like Haman, who hated Mordecai and the Israelites and set up a high pole to execute them, but ended up being the ones who were executed on the pole. Third, everything is not up to human skills and tricks, but up to God. God clearly showed that everything is in God's hands by saving Daniel from the hands of his enemies. When the incident was over, Darius issued an edict. The core of the document was, "Daniel, fear and tremble before your God." Nebuchadnezzar issued an edict that said, "Do not language who say anything against the God." When Daniel's 3 friends were miraculously saved from the fiery furnace, Daniel 3:29. And when Daniel interpreted the dream, he only praised God. However, Darius went one step further and in verse 26. He said, "I issue a decree that in every part of my kingdom people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel. For he is the living God and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed, his dominion will never end." Must fear and reverence the God. He prescribed the correct attitude toward God. Darius explained at length why all people should fear and revere God. In particular, Daniel's God is a living God, a God who will never change, his kingdom will never be destroyed, and his dominion will last forever. This is because when God saved Daniel from the mouth of the lion, the people of Israel were able to strengthen their hope in God. It is also said that Daniel prospered during the reign of King Darius and King Cyrus. In verse 28, it says, "So Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian." We can learn the attitude of prayer from Daniel. He knelt down to pray to God. Kneeling down is submission to God and entrusting oneself to God. Daniel knew very well that he and his people were rightfully forsaken by God because of their sins. Therefore, he did not approach God in pride. He only went to God in hope of his mercy and power. And we also learn from Daniel that we can solve all problems through prayer. When he faced problems, he could have relied on his life experience and wisdom to solve them. Or he could have met people, talked to them, lobbied, and asked for help. This would seem to solve the problem, but strangely enough, it only gets worse. We must believe that God is the solution to our problems and quietly go to God to pray. Then God himself will solve the problem. God also provides the strength, wisdom, and faith to solve problems for those who pray. A spiritual person like Daniel comes to God in silence with all his problems. He hates people and fights against the flesh and blood, or he fights against Satan in prayer without fighting against the flesh and blood. Through this, he realizes spiritual secrets and grows spiritually. How was Daniel able to fight a spiritual battle in prayer without fighting a battle of flesh and blood in this crisis? It was because Daniel trusted God. In the text, Daniel often uses the words, "my God." Daniel loved his God with all his heart and relied on his God completely. He knew that his life was not at the mercy of his enemies, but in the hands of his God. At this time, he could entrust his life completely to God and pray for himself and his people in peace. We each have our own, "my God." This God has saved me from sin, protected me in this rough world, and guided me thus far. This God is the one who stands by believers and gives them victory. When we fully rely on this God, we are not afraid of the world, no matter how turbulent and dangerous it is. Then he gives us victory in the midst of any work of Satan. And Daniel believed that the truth would prevail. In verse 22, he said, "Because I was found innocent in his sight, nor have I ever done any wrong before you, your majesty." Daniel had lived for the glory of God without any personal interest before God. He had kept his purity and righteousness. Therefore, he had no reason to be ashamed. Therefore, he stood clearly on the side of the truth, not wavering even when he learned that a letter of accusation had been written against him and the king's seal had been affixed. Sometimes it seems that people who use cunning and tricks and believe in their own wiles are successful, while people who are honest and live by the truth seem to be at a loss and end up losing. But all of this is only temporary. In the end, the truth will prevail. Daniel has lived for the glory of God without any personal gain. He has kept his purity and righteousness. Therefore, he had no reason to be ashamed. Even though he knew that a document had been written against him and stamped with the king's seal, he stood firmly on the side of truth. Sometimes it seems that people who use cunning and tricks and believe in their own wiles are successful, while people who are honest and live by the truth seem to be at a loss and end up losing. But all of this is only temporary. In the end, the truth will prevail. God is alive and on the side of the truth. We just need to fight for the truth and God will give us victory. Therefore, Daniel was able to stand on the side of the truth and fight for the truth without fighting in a human way to the end. Therefore, we must not stop praying no matter what happens in the future. I pray that you will enter the ranks of the 5 wise virgins who are always awake and praying so that the anointing of the Holy Spirit will not be cut off.